The morning the surveyor's truck rolled up the gravel drive, Eleanor Hargrove was standing in the west field with a mason jar of dirt in her hand, watching it sift through her fingers like flour through a broken sack. It wasn't supposed to do that. Not in August. Not even in a bad August. But this was the driest summer Blaine County had seen since her father was a boy. And the soil out here on the Montana plains had gone the color of ash, cracking into flat plates that crunched underfoot like old pottery. Eleanor could remember as a girl digging her toes into this same ground and feeling it cool and damp 2 inches down even in July. Now the truck's tires kicked up dust that hung in the air for a full minute after it passed, refusing to settle, as if the earth itself had lost the will to hold on to anything. She let the dirt fall and closed her hand into a fist, and that was when she heard the car doors slam, and her son Daniel's voice carrying across the field, already talking numbers before he'd even reached her. Mom, the guy's only got till noon. He's got 2 more properties after ours. Then he can go see them, Eleanor said, without turning around. Daniel caught up to her, a little out of breath, sweat already soaking through his collar, though it wasn't yet 8 in the morning. Behind him came his sister Carol, arms crossed, sunglasses pushed up into hair she'd had colored a shade lighter than Eleanor remembered from the Christmas. And behind Carol, hanging back like he always did when things got tense, was the youngest, Wyatt, 34 years old, and still, in Eleanor's eyes, the boy who used to fall asleep in the truck bed on the drive back from the grain elevator. We talked about this, Carol said. We agreed, all of us. I don't recall agreeing to anything, Eleanor said. I recall the 3 of you agreeing and calling to tell me about it. Mom, please. Daniel scrubbed a hand over his face. He had their father's face, square-jawed and sun-weathered, even though he'd left the farm for an insurance job in Billings 15 years ago and rarely came back except for holidays and, lately, appraisals. This isn't personal, it's math. You've got 420 acres of dry land wheat that hasn't turned a profit in 3 years, a house that needs a new roof, and a well system that's been dead since before I was born. The offer on the table right now today is the best this land has seen in a decade, because Ferris Ag Holdings wants to consolidate the section next door, and we happen to sit in the middle of it. That kind of offer doesn't come twice. Your grandfather built this place with his own hands, Eleanor said. Grandpa's been gone 22 years, Carol said gently. The way you'd correct a child, and something in Eleanor's chest went tight and hot at the tone of it. We loved him too, but loving this place doesn't make the drought go away, and it doesn't pay the property taxes, and it sure doesn't fix that well. Eleanor looked past her children, out over the fields at the low, gray-brown haze sitting on the horizon, where smoke from a fire 2 counties over had settled in and refused to leave, the way everything unwelcome seemed to be doing lately. She thought of 31 years standing in front of a chalkboard in the one schoolhouse still open in this end of the county, teaching multiplication and long division to children whose parents and grandparents had learned their own multiplication tables in that same room. She thought of the way she used to tell them, when they got frustrated with a hard problem, that quitting was the only way to guarantee you'd never solve it. I'm not signing anything, she said. Not today, not for that man, and not for Ferris Ag Holdings. Mom, Daniel's voice cracked just slightly, in a way that told her this had cost him more than he wanted to admit. The phone calls, the spreadsheets, probably an argument with his wife about whether to even bring this up again. We're not doing this to hurt you. We're doing this because we're scared. Look at the ground. Look at what's happening to every ranch and farm in this county. The Petersons sold in June. The Whitfield place went under in July. If we don't sell now, while somebody wants it, we're going to end up losing it anyway, for nothing. And you'll be sitting alone out here with no water and no money and 3 kids 200 miles away who can't get to you fast enough if something goes wrong. The surveyor, a young man in a golf shirt with a clipboard, had the decency to stay by his truck and pretend to be checking his phone. "I appreciate that you're scared," Eleanor said finally. "I am too. But being scared isn't a reason to give up on something before you've tried everything you know how to try." "We have tried everything," Carol said. "The well's been dry since before any of us were born, Mom. Dad tried to get it working when we were kids, don't you remember? He and Uncle Ray spent a whole summer on it. Nothing. It's not a well anymore. It's a hole in the ground with our money buried in it." Eleanor did remember. She remembered her late husband, Frank, coming in from the well house night after night that summer, his hands raw and his voice tight with a frustration he tried to keep from the children, muttering about collapsed casing and dry sediment and a water table that might as well be on the moon. She remembered him finally boarding over the well house door and telling her quietly, in bed, that some things just weren't meant to be fixed, and that they'd have to make do with what the sky gave them from now on. She had believed him. For 40 years she had believed him. But something about seeing that surveyor's truck in her driveway, about hearing her own children speak of her home the way you'd speak of a car that wasn't worth repairing anymore, put a stubbornness in her that she hadn't felt in years. Not since she'd fought the school board, back in the 90s, to keep the one-room schoolhouse open when they wanted to bus all the rural kids 40 minutes into town. "Give me 30 days, she said. "Mom, the offer." 30 days, she said again. And there was something in her voice, some old teacher's register that could quiet a room of restless 9-year-olds, that made all 3 of her children go still. "If in 30 days I can't show you a reason to keep this place, I will sign whatever you put in front of me, and I won't say another word about it. But you will give me 30 days first, because I have given all 3 of you a great deal more than that over the years. And I am asking for this one thing." Daniel looked at Carol. Carol looked at Wyatt, who had said nothing this whole time, and who now looked at his boots and then briefly at his mother, with something that might have been hope. 30 days, Daniel said at last. "But Mom, after that, if there's nothing, you have to let it go. Please." Eleanor didn't answer that. She only watched the surveyor climb back into his truck and pull away down the drive, dust rising up behind him and drifting, slow and unwilling, back down onto the parched earth. The well house sat at the northern edge of the yard, a squat structure of gray, weathered boards that had once been painted red, tucked between the old equipment shed and a stand of cottonwoods that were dying from the drought, same as everything else. Frank had nailed a sheet of plywood over the door 40 years ago, and Eleanor had never had cause to touch it since. She stood in front of it now with a crowbar in her hand, feeling faintly ridiculous, an old woman about to pry open a door that everyone in her family agreed led nowhere. She thought of Hal Brennan. Hal ran the only garage left in Coldwater Creek, a town of 600 people, 40 minutes from the farm, and he had a reputation, not entirely deserved, in Eleanor's opinion, for being able to fix anything with an engine in it, and a fair number of things that didn't have engines at all. He'd fixed her truck's transmission 2 summers back for half what the dealership in town wanted, and thrown in an oil change for free because, he said, she once let his daughter make up a missed test after a family emergency, back when Eleanor still taught. Hal was in his 50s now, broad-shouldered, with a beard going gray, and a habit of chewing on the stem of an unlit pipe while he thought something through. She called him that evening. "Groundwater's not really my department, Mrs. Hargrove," he said, though she could hear the interest creeping into his voice even as he said it. "But I've done some plumbing, and I did help old Delbert Faust re-drill his well out past Turner Creek a few years back. What's the setup out there?" "Artesian well? My father-in-law dug it back in the 50s. Casing's steel, I think. It ran fine for years, and then it just stopped. My husband and his brother tried to fix it back in the 80s and gave up on it." "What'd they figure was wrong?" "Frank always said the water table dropped. Said the aquifer dried up, same as everything else out this way." There was a pause on the line, and Eleanor could picture Hal chewing on that pipe stem, turning something over. "That's an odd thing," he said slowly. "Artesian wells don't usually just up and die the way a regular dug well does. If it's a true artesian system, the water's under pressure from an aquifer that's usually a good deal more stable than surface water. Takes something pretty significant to kill one dead. Casing collapse, contamination, or sediment plugging the intake. A dropping water table's more what you'd expect from a shallow well, not a deep artesian one. So you're saying it might not be the drought that killed it?" "I'm saying I'd want to look at it before I said anything for certain. You mind if I come out tomorrow?" Hal arrived a little after 8 the next morning in a truck that had seen even harder years than Eleanor's, with a toolbox in the bed that rattled like a drawer full of silverware every time he hit a rut in the drive. He climbed out, shook her hand, and looked over at the well house with the frank, assessing gaze of a man sizing up an engine before he'd even opened the hood. "Your boy know you're doing this?" he asked, not unkindly, as they walked toward it together. "My children think I'm being sentimental," Eleanor said. "Well?" Hal set his toolbox down at the well house door. "Sentimental's usually a word people use for something they haven't bothered to check yet." They pried the plywood loose together. It came away easier than Eleanor expected. The nails rusted thin and brittle, some of them crumbling to orange dust the moment Hal's crowbar touched them. Behind it, the door to the well house itself had swollen and warped in its frame, and it took both of them shoving together to force it open, releasing a smell of cold stone and standing dust, the particular smell of a room that had not felt fresh air in 4 decades. Inside, the wellhead sat exactly as it must have been left, a heavy iron wellhead cap bolted down over a length of steel casing that disappeared into a concrete platform in the floor. An old jet pump sat rusted beside it, disconnected, its motor housing crusted with decades of dirt and mouse droppings and the papery remains of wasp nests. Hal crouched down and ran a hand along the casing, then along the concrete, frowning. "Casing's in good shape," he said. "Steel's thick. This was built to last. No sign of collapse that I can see from up here." He tapped the wellhead cap. "This is bolted down tight. Somebody sealed this up properly, not in a hurry. That's not what panic looks like. That's somebody being careful." Frank was careful, Eleanor said. About most things. Hal worked the bolts loose with a wrench from his toolbox, grunting with the effort of breaking 40 years of rust, until finally the cap gave way with a shriek of protesting metal and came free in his hands. He set it aside and leaned over the opening, shining a flashlight down into the dark. For a long moment, he said nothing. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said finally, "come take a look at this." Eleanor knelt beside him, her knees protesting the position in a way they hadn't when she was younger, and looked down into the well. The beam of the flashlight caught the steel casing running straight down, clean and true, disappearing into darkness. But there, perhaps 15 feet down, the light caught on something pale and solid. a compacted mass that filled the shaft nearly to the walls. "That's not water down there," Hal said. "That's silt. Compacted sediment probably built up over years before whoever capped this even sealed it. If your husband and his brother came down here and saw that, and didn't know what they were looking at, they might have assumed the aquifer itself had gone dry, that there just wasn't any water left to find. But sediment blocking a well shaft and an aquifer actually drying up are two completely different problems. One of them means the well's dead forever. The other one just means somebody's got some digging to do. Eleanor felt something in her chest that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in days, not since the surveyor's truck had come up the drive. A small, cautious flicker of something that might, if she let it, grow into hope. "Can you tell which one this is?" she asked. Hal sat back on his heels, chewing his pipe stem, looking down into the shaft with the same expression he wore when he had a stubborn engine open on the lift back at the garage. Not impatience, but a kind of pleasure at a genuine puzzle. "Not for certain, not from here," he admitted. "But I'll tell you what I do know. Artesian wells are fed by pressure from an aquifer that sits below an impermeable layer, clay, shale, something that traps the water and keeps it under pressure. So when you punch through it, the water wants to rise on its own, sometimes even flow above ground without a pump at all. That's what made this well worth digging back in the 50s. Your father-in-law wouldn't have gone through the expense of drilling this deep for an ordinary shallow well. If the aquifer that feeds this thing is a regional one, and out here on the plains, there's a good chance it is, connected to the same deep water that feeds wells clear over toward the Bear Paw foothills, then it likely never dried up at all. A regional aquifer that size takes decades, sometimes centuries, of sustained overuse or real geological shift to actually deplete. One bad decade of drought on the surface wouldn't touch it, not down at that depth. Then why did it stop running? My guess, Hal said. Something upstream of this well shifted. An earthquake tremor, even a small one, ground settling. A flood event decades back that washed a slug of sediment down the shaft before it was properly capped. It happens more than folks think, especially with older wells that weren't lined all the way with a proper sanitary seal at the top. Once sediment gets moving and starts settling in a shaft like this, it can build up fast. And once it's compacted enough, it blocks the flow completely, even if the water pressure below is still fighting to get up. Your husband and his brother-in-law would have opened this cap, seen sediment, maybe struck it a few times, found no water coming, and concluded the well itself was finished. Reasonable thing to think 40 years ago without the equipment to know different. But reasonable and correct aren't always the same animal. So it might still be down there, Eleanor said. The water? It might, Hal said. I can't promise you it is, but I'll tell you this much. I've seen wells like this before, and I've seen sediment blockages before, and this doesn't smell like a dead well to me. This smells like a well that's been buried alive. The next 2 weeks were the strangest of Eleanor's life since Frank's funeral, filled with a kind of purposeful, almost giddy labor that reminded her, oddly, of the week before the first day of school each year, when she used to arrange her classroom just so, certain that this year, finally, she would get everything right. Hal brought in a friend of his, a semi-retired well driller named Curtis Odom, who'd spent 35 years punching holes in the Montana plains before his knees gave out, and he switched to consulting. Curtis arrived in a truck loaded with equipment Eleanor didn't recognize. A baler on a cable winch, a small compressor, lengths of airline hose, and spent the better part of an afternoon simply listening to Hal's account of what they'd found, nodding, asking sharp, Specific questions about the casing diameter and the well's original depth records, which Eleanor, to her own surprise, still had, tucked away in a metal filing box in the farmhouse basement alongside Frank's old ledgers. 55 years old, cased 210 feet, artesian flow reported at initial completion. Curtis read aloud from the yellow drilling log, whistling low. That's a good well. Now, that's a real good well if the numbers on this thing are honest, which back in the 50s they usually were, because a man's reputation depended on it more than his paperwork did. They worked the bailer down the shaft first, a long steel cylinder with a valve at the bottom that could be dropped and raised repeatedly to scoop out loose material. And for 2 days, that was all they did. Drop, raise, empty, drop again, hauling up cylinder after cylinder of compacted, gray-brown silt that had the dense, water-logged heaviness of clay that had been sitting wet and undisturbed for decades. Eleanor watched from the well house door, offering coffee and sandwiches, and more than once, simply standing quietly while the two men worked, feeling every bit the school teacher watching a science experiment she didn't fully understand, but recognized, on some level, as important. Daniel called twice during those 2 weeks. The first time, he asked cautiously how things were going, and Eleanor told him, honestly, that they were still digging, that nothing was certain yet. And she could hear the careful neutrality in his voice, the effort of a man trying not to get his hopes up on his mother's behalf while also trying not to sound as if he hoped she'd fail. The second time he mentioned, almost apologetically, that the man from Ferris Ag Holdings had called again, wanting to know if the 30 days still stood. They still stand, Eleanor told him. 22 days left, Daniel. I intend to use every one of them. Carol didn't call at all, though Wyatt did once late in the evening, his voice quiet on the line, the way it always was when he had something he wanted to say and wasn't sure how. Mom, he said, I hope you find water down there. So do I, Eleanor said. I mean it, he said. I know Carol and Danny think I just don't want to deal with the fight. But I remember Grandpa out there in that field. I remember him letting me ride on the tractor with him when I don't even know how old, 6 maybe. I don't want that to just be gone. I don't want to be the reason it's gone. You're not the reason for anything, Wyatt, Eleanor said. None of you are. This isn't about blame. It's about whether there's still something worth fighting for out here, or whether your grandfather's stubbornness finally ran its course. I intend to find out. On the 12th day, Curtis's bailer came up dripping. He held it out for Hal and Eleanor to see, tilting it so the gray water inside caught the afternoon light, and though it was murky and faintly sulfurous smelling, it was unmistakably water. Not the dry, dust-caked silt they'd been hauling up for a week and a half, but genuine groundwater, seeping in from somewhere below the blockage they'd been clearing. There she is, Curtis said, grinning with the particular satisfaction of a man whose instincts had just been vindicated. Told you. That aquifer never went anywhere. It's been sitting down there patient as Sunday, just waiting on somebody to clear the road back up to it. Eleanor put a hand over her mouth, and for a moment she couldn't speak at all. It took another 6 days to clear the shaft fully, flush the well of the last of the sediment, and haul in a new submersible pump size to the casing, since the old jet pump Frank had used decades ago was long past salvaging. Hal handled the electrical work himself, running new wire out from the barn's service panel, muttering the whole time about how his own father would have had a fit at some of the shortcuts the original wiring had taken back in the 70s. Eleanor spent those 6 days doing something she hadn't done in years. She called around. She called the county extension office and asked about current wheat prices, and what a working irrigation system might mean for planting a fall crop, even a late one, even a modest one, if there was still time before frost. She called an old friend from her teaching days whose husband ran an irrigation supply business 2 counties over and arranged on credit against the harvest to come for pipe and sprinkler heads and the fittings needed to connect the old well to the network of irrigation lines that had sat dry and half-buried in the fields for 4 decades. Lines Frank had never had the heart to dig up even after he'd given up hope of ever running water through them again. On the 28th day of her 30, with Daniel and Carol and Wyatt all standing in the yard because Eleanor had called them the night before and simply said, "Come home, all of you." Tomorrow morning, Hal Brennan flipped the breaker on the new pump. For a moment, nothing happened. Eleanor heard the low hum of the motor kick on somewhere below ground, felt Daniel's hand find her shoulder, unconsciously, the way it used to when he was young and nervous about something. Carol had her arms crossed again, but her jaw was tight in a way that had nothing to do with skepticism. Wyatt was already crying, quietly, and hadn't bothered to hide it. Then, from the pipe running out to the near field, water began to flow. It came slow at first, a trickle, then a steady stream, then, as the pump caught its rhythm and the pressure built through the newly connected lines, a genuine surge, water running dark and cold and mineral-scented across ground so parched it seemed almost to gasp at the touch of it, soaking in immediately, disappearing into the cracked earth as though the soil itself had been holding its breath for 40 years and had finally been allowed to exhale. Nobody said anything for a long moment. They simply stood and watched water run across Hargrove land for the first time since Nixon was president. "Mom," Daniel said finally, his voice thick. "Mom, I'm sorry. I should never have—" "You were scared," Eleanor said, and found she meant it without a trace of bitterness. "Scared, people say foolish things sometimes. I've done it myself, more than once. It doesn't need forgiving, Daniel. It just needed answering." Carol had walked out into the field, heedless of her shoes, and stood with her face turned up to the pale afternoon sun, water soaking into the ground around her ankles. "Grandpa would have laughed himself sick," she said half to herself. 40 years. And it just needed somebody stubborn enough to dig it out. "He was plenty stubborn himself," Eleanor said. "He just ran out of years to be stubborn in. I still had a few left." Word travels fast in a county of 600 people, and faster still during a drought bad enough to make the evening news out of Great Falls. Within a week, half of Coldwater Creek had found some excuse to drive out past the Hargrove place, slowing at the fence line to look at the green haze already beginning to show in the near field where the water had reached, a color that hadn't been seen on that particular stretch of ground in longer than most of the onlookers had been alive. The county extension agent came out to take soil samples and talk with cautious optimism about what a functioning artesian well might mean not just for the Hargrove acreage, but for 2 neighboring farms that shared the same aquifer and might, with the right easements, tap into the same source. The local paper ran a story with a photograph of Eleanor standing at the wellhead, Hal Brennan beside her with his pipe clenched, unlit between his teeth, both of them squinting against the sun. The headline writer, with more flourish than Eleanor would have chosen herself, called her "the woman who refused to let the well die," which struck her as slightly overwrought until she reread it a few times and decided, privately, that she rather liked it after all. The man from Ferris Ag Holdings did not call again. Eleanor stood at her kitchen window most evenings that fall, watching the sprinklers turn slow circles over ground that was, for the first time in 40 years, allowed to be more than merely surviving. Ground that was, however modestly, being given the chance to grow something. She thought of the surveyor's truck pulling up the drive, of the dirt sifting through her fingers like flour, of 30 days that had felt, at the start, like an act of pure stubbornness, with almost no reasonable hope behind it. She thought, too, of standing in front of a classroom for 31 years, telling children again and again that quitting was the only guaranteed way to fail, and she wondered whether she had ever quite believed it herself, in her own bones, until the summer she was 63 years old and dug an old well back up out of the ground with her own 2 hands, more or less, and proved it true. Daniel came back out most weekends now, not for appraisals, but to help repair fence and lay pipe. Carol had started talking, tentatively, about whether there was a market for the kind of specialty wheat that fetched a premium at the mill in Havre, now that there was water enough to consider it. Wyatt had said, one evening in October, watching the sun go down gold and orange over fields that were green again at the margins, that he thought he might move back if his mother didn't mind the company. Eleanor told him she didn't mind at all. The old well ran quietly beneath the earth all that winter and into the spring, its water rising up through decades of darkness the same patient, stubborn way it always had, waiting, as Curtis Odom had put it, with the plain, unshakable confidence of a man who had spent his whole life listening to what the ground had to say, for somebody willing to dig deep enough and refuse hard enough to let it finally come home.